fresh about questions of human rights and about the ways we can imagine and talk about human rights within the international system. I was reminded when I looked at the pamphlet of a quotation by the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which I think is opposite this afternoon. He once said that the law may not be able to make a man love me, but at least it can keep him from lynching me. And I think in this context, when we're talking not simply about the real physical violence that gay men, lesbians, bisexuals, transgender people, and intersex persons face across the globe, even in those countries that have formal legal regimes that protect the rights of sexual minorities. And we're talking not only about physical violence, but about the structural violence of social exclusion. It might be useful as a first step, before we even get to the question of the love story, to talk about basic considerations of equal concern and respect for the humanity and the dignity and the integrity of the lives of LGBTI persons and their loved ones. I can think of no better collection of persons to be present here on the podium to begin a conversation here than those you see before you. Their simple presence here this afternoon, I think, confirms for me at least categorically that this is most emphatically not a side event, but one that ought to be central, right, to the concerns of everyone in the international community who believes in equal, full, and substantive human rights for all persons, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their sexuality, their gender, their sexual orientation, or their gender identity. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to begin by introducing themselves and saying a few words to you about the nature of the work they do that is related to the cause of human rights for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons. And we will begin with the panelist who sits to my far right, Marianne Mollmann. I'm sorry, Susana Reid. Sorry, my glasses.
We get, people get confused between.
Well, I was told that these three folks work together all the time, so I'm going to deliberately mix up their names.
Absolutely. Just call me Graeme.
All right, great. Susana Reid.
Hi, yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. When I saw the title, LGBT Rights in the UN, When Will the Love Story Begin, it struck me that it was, I'm not sure that love is precisely the way I would put the work we do at the UN, other than the passion we may feel toward our work. But be that as it may, I have actually been working on this issue for many years. And I wanted to actually start with a little correction, because while it's true that the resolution passed in 2011, in fact, some reference to sexual orientation has existed in UN resolutions since, I think, 2002, if I'm correct, for the GA resolution on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary execution. So I think it's useful to remember that history and to build from where we are, and obviously keep going and recognize where the gaps are. But I also think it's important to remember that history, because that history reflects the work of a lot of folks like you who were doing this work in 2000, 2001, 2002, and so it's also part of keeping our own history in mind as we continue to do this work. In fact, there was a reference to people living outside of heterosexual relations, kind of funny formulation as far back as I think it was 1996 in the report of the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. So just a little bit of history. So I am the Senior Gender Advisor in the HIV Health and Development Group at UNDP. And because of where I sit, I think I have a perspective on the work that we do around LGBT issues that is in fact different from many people in UNDP, as well as in a lot of the UN, save a couple of places, and I'll talk a little bit about that. My background includes extensive work on LGBT issues, on sexual rights issues, on women's rights issues, including work on sex worker rights issues, so kind of running the gamut. And I joined the UN about 5.5 years ago, quite to my own surprise. But in fact, I think it's useful in this conversation to make a distinction between the UN that most of you are focusing on, which is the world of diplomacy, and the part of the UN where I work, which is the world of development assistance. Because it's quite different, and the ways in which LGBT issues come up, raise themselves up and get addressed are quite different, because in fact the work that we do doesn't require ongoing negotiation. What it does require is evidence that allows us to make an argument that that's work that we should be doing. And I have certainly found that in our HIV work, it's not hard to point to the evidence that if you don't look at issues of sexual orientation and gender identity, if you don't look at what's happening with sex workers, with drug users, then you won't have an effective HIV response. And because by now that evidence is quite strong, not saying that evidence isn't political, it's very political, but we now have very good evidence in HIV that allows us to make a strong case for why our work needs to take issues of sexual orientation and gender identity, issues of marginalization very seriously, and in the work that we do in countries, make a case to governments who we're providing assistance to that if they want to have effective HIV responses, they have to look at who's getting infected, and when you look at who's getting infected, even in countries that have what are called generalized epidemics, so where there's a large proportion of the population, or a significant proportion of the population living with HIV, even in those countries, there remains a higher rates of HIV among men who have sex with men, and to the extent that we have the information, an even higher level of HIV among transgender people. So because of where we sit, we have the opportunity to raise those issues, not in the diplomatic context, but in the development assistance context in terms of the ongoing work that we can do. Should I stop or?
We will certainly be coming back to you. So we will now move to your colleague, to your immediate left, and that is indeed Marianne, who is with EagleHer. Please say a little bit about your work with EagleHer and why are you here today?
Okay, so my name is Marianne Mollmann. I am Director of Programs with the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission. And while Susana has been 5.5 years with the UN, I have been more or less 5.5 days with EagleHer. So I'm very new to this position. I have a background working on gender and sexual rights and reproductive rights. And I actually remember having conversations about the intersections, about gender issues and gender stereotyping from like decades ago when I first started working in human rights. So this has been a thread that's running through my for many years. Eagle-Herc is an organization that is a youth delegate, as it were. It's a 20-odd-year-old organization. We work on documentation of human rights violations that affect LGBTI persons specifically or disproportionately in specific countries across the world. We do have a presence that's predominantly in the global south, and we have specific focus countries in each different region. We do I think the best way to truncate what we do is to say we try to provide a link between what happens in our host countries with the UN. So we try to support local activists in elevating national and local activism to a global level, and then bringing whatever can happen at the UN back to the national and the local level. And I too want to have a bit of a correction in my introduction. I think the UN has actually brought up sexual orientation and gender identity quite more than I would have expected. This year alone, and mostly at the regional level, this year alone, both in the Asia-Pacific region and in the Latin American-Caribbean region, there were declarations adopted at the governmental level that mentioned sexual rights, sexual orientation, gender identity, the need for and right to comprehensive sexuality education, and a much more sort of empowerment approach to LGBTI issues than what we see in this part of the UN, which is focused so heavily on violence. And for me, the love story cannot begin at the UN until we move beyond the right not to be beaten up, or the right not to be executed, or the right not to be killed. And I think that one of the things that, I looked up some statistics as well when I prepared for this event, and one of the things that was striking for me just from the US, which is a country where there's quite a lot of acceptance of LGBTI populations comparatively, 18 to 30-year-olds who identify as LGBTI in some way are almost 2.5 times more likely to suffer physical violence than LGBTI persons who are over 30. And part of that, I think, has to do with a study that was published, or the evidence that went into a study that was published a year ago that says that half of students between 7th and 12th grade, so between 12 years and let's say 17 years, half of students, those students in this country, are subject to sexual harassment. And that sexual harassment is not have sex with me or kiss me or whatever that may be. That is overwhelmingly now not a sexual advance that is unwanted. It is bullying and hostility towards a person for not having a normal sexuality. Whether it's directed against girls because they have too much sex, they're sluts, too little sex, they're prudes, or whether it's directed against children who are not heteronormative, who don't seem like they're not cisgender, they don't look straight, they don't talk straight, they don't feel straight. And so that hostility is what translates into violence. So I guess what all of this means in this presentation, I understand the focus on violence. I don't think we can move beyond just seeing ourselves as victims until we move to a place where it's about all of us having the right to bodily autonomy regardless of our sexual orientation and gender identity. So that it's not a siloed approach that we're helping those poor populations who are not identified as straight or who are not cisgendered, but rather everybody has a right to bodily autonomy.
Thank you. Graeme, Reid.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
It is. Okay, I'm just going to start by telling you a bit about my background. I am from South Africa, and that has been very formative in terms of my approach to the kind of work that I do today. And it's been formative in a range of different ways. On the one hand, I lived through the experience of social transformation in South Africa, and that was, of course, very much a youth-led process within South Africa, so I'm very cognizant of the potential of youth to bring about change. I was also made aware of the very strong links between LGBT activism and broader human rights activism. So the links between the anti-apartheid movement and the LGBT movement, however tenuous at a certain point that was, has achieved enormous results by that solidarity within a broader human rights framework. I describe myself both as an activist and academic. I've moved between those two worlds, and I feel in my current job have managed to bring those two worlds together. But I'm an anthropologist, and so I'm very interested